Today's moderator is Sree. She is a research scholar in the department, and she's working on disciplining gender, history of modern schooling in 19th and early 20th century Cochin. Over to you, Teresa, to take over the proceedings.
Good evening to all. Welcome to the 7th lecture of International Online Workshop, organized by Department of History, Sri Shankara University, Kaladi, in support of KCHR. Today, we have eminent gender historian, Professor J. Devika is with us to speak on literature and creative archive. Dr. J. Devika has contributed immensely to the discipline of modern history of Kerala, especially to the gender and politics in the region. Her interventions in the contemporary social analysis is multidimensional and internationally acclaimed. Dr. J. Devika's early research was about evidence of modern binary gender as a language of describing society and social change in the early 20th century. She is a voracious writer, published many books in the social science discipline. She also translated a number of books from Malayalam to English. Notable among them are Nalini Jamila's autobiography, the well-acclaimed Malayalam novel Arachar by K.R. Meera, and short stories of Sarah Joseph and K.R. Meera. She is a well-known Malayali historian, feminist, social critic, academician, and most importantly, a social activist in Kerala. I would like to invite Sitara IP, PhD scholar in History Department, to introduce the speaker and deliver the speech.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you are audible.
Thank you. Good evening to all. I'm very happy to welcome all to the next session of the workshop, Sensing the Past, Thematical Departure and Archival Researches. The dignitary of the day is Dr. J. Devika ma'am. Dr. J. Devika is a very familiar face in the academic scenario of contemporary India. J. Devika is a social researcher, historian, translator, and teacher. Presently, professor at the Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum, Kerala. She pursued her master's from JNU and PhD from MG University, Kottayam. She has written on the intertwined histories of gender, politics, culture, and developments in Kerala, and has translated literature from Malayalam to English and social science from English to Malayalam. She offers social commentary on Kafila online and maintains at the website swatantravadini.in. Her publications include Engendering Individuals, The Language of Reforming in Early 20th Century Kerala, Woman Writing, Man Reading, Kulasriyum Chandapennum Undayadengane, etc. In her work, Kulasriyum Chandapennum Undayadengane, she gave us an alternative reading of Kerala history in a feminist perspective. Once again, I welcome ma'am to this program, and I also welcome all the delegates present over from the different corners of India. And I am sure this session will be thought-provoking and meaningful for all, one and all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sitara. Now the platform is open for you, Devika ma'am.
So thank you very much, both of you, and thank you very much, Shiva, for giving me this opportunity. But I must confess at the outset, and I must warn you at the outset, that I'm not really a historian anymore in a conventional sense. That is, I really don't identify with the community of historians anymore primarily, nor I do teach much history. I teach a little bit of economic history at the MA level, but I mean, my teaching in history ends there. I'm a historian only in the sense that I use the historical perspective extensively in the work that I do, which is to make sense of contemporary events in Kerala. So history can be understood as a discipline or as a perspective. As a discipline, of course, we know there are codes which one must be placed within. As a perspective, however, history can really be of relevance to any kind of inquiry, ranging from say, theoretical physics to biology, perhaps. So the whole range. So it is in that sense that I'm a historian, in the sense that I really make use of the historical perspective, of the training that I've had as a historian. I bring that to bear on my efforts to understand contemporary issues. Only in that sense I'm a historian anymore. Therefore, I must really tell you that I'm not very updated on the literature in the discipline of history. That is true. And therefore, I thought that the best way to participate in this workshop would be to focus on my own journey, but perhaps to think about my own journey as a historian, to reflect on how I have made use of literature as a source in my own historical research. I'm actually quite grateful to Sheba for pushing me in this direction of reflection, because only when I actually started thinking about this lecture did I realize that this, my own use of literature, my own engagement with literature as a source has shaped my later work quite a lot. For example, in my translations, when I translate Malayalam literature, I read texts with a historian's eye. And so identify the different layers of time and multiplicity of voices and positions in every text that I translate. And I strive to carry these into the English version. So that came really from my engagement with literature as a historian, from this.
Devika, your mic has been muted. Could you check that? Yeah, fine.
Okay, so no, I was just saying that this, Sheba's effort was important for me, because if she had not pushed me into thinking about this lecture, I probably would not have realized how central my engagement with literature as a historian was to my later work. For example, in my translations, I always look at the text that I translate with a historian's eye. One tries to look at the different layers of time, that is sedimented in the text, look at the multiplicity of voices that come from different points in time. And the effort then is to move all this into the English version. I would not have done that if I did not really engage with literature as a historian. Let me begin. I suppose to begin with, I should start with the intellectual currents of the 1980s in Kerala, which made it possible for me as a young student here to approach literature as a potential source material for historical research. So there is some theoretical background that was conducive to us approaching literature as a potential source. Because at that time, in history, especially in Kerala, modern history particularly, was largely political history. And there was social history, but it was focused much more on quantification and quantifiable numbers, so archival evidence, etc. But there was, I will come to why why I really needed to look at literature when I became a historian. But before that, I think I need to tell you about the theoretical inspiration of the 1980s. Many of the theoretical discussion in the 1980s in Kerala, particularly conducive for this kind of a move. So I can remember 3 distinct streams of theory here, some of which I encountered in public discussions in Kerala, some others as a student in Delhi, and some others in Kottayam in the 1990s. Now, these all 3 were equally important in stripping off liberal ideas about literature, which are all about literary genius and unique and unreplicable acts or artifacts of value, and about a seemingly unassailable literary canon, and all these ideas which we mostly inherit through our schooling. Without exposure to these currents of theory, perhaps I would have never come to the understanding that history can actually become a viable source for historical research. So the first of these theoretical trends was a range of theories actually between, say, Russian formalism and French structuralism. Now, all of these claim to be engaged in the examination of language or literature or other semiotic artifacts, identifying their formal properties or categories or units of analysis or first rules of composition, etc. So, for example, French structuralism, for example, was much discussed in the 80s and basic introductory work on Saussure and others, and Levi-Strauss, for example. We already had in Malayalam, if I remember right, Dr. Rajan Gurukal's early book, not to mention structuralist Marxism, it was also quite well discussed here. And in anthropology, you had Levi-Strauss or Kusteva in language and narrative. You had Barth, of course. Barth was particularly discussed in culture. So in all these, the distinction between the literary and the non-literary was rendered irrelevant, at least from a theoretical perspective. So suddenly the kind of magical halo around literature as the product of a unique genius, which is beyond history, which cannot be historicized, that kind of mystique melted, I think, in the face of this kind of theorizing, and especially its application to our own material, particularly our medieval literature, in medieval Patasahityan and Kavyams, etc. The possibilities of doing that were raised in this time. And this also challenged the boundaries of discipline. So now it looked like anthropology and history and semiotics were all leaking into each other. So in some sense, the boundaries of these disciplines were rendered porous by this body of this range of theories. Of course, the thing is that despite the fact that it dispelled this mystique of literature, it did not really affect the text/context divide. So, in fact, very often, and there are some exceptions to what I'm going to say. For example, Barth was not like that. Nevertheless, most of these theories allowed us to analyze literary works as abstract linguistic narrative entities, which in and through which we may glimpse an abstract, universal, unchanging structure of thought. So even as these theories dispel the mystique of literature, they still preserved literature from history. In some sense, they were expressions of a timeless patterns, timeless, unchanging structures of human thought. So this was one of the three streams that was influential. The second stream was the work of historians like Hayden White and Louis Mink. These insights, and particularly those of Hayden White, were crucial because they highlighted the similarity between history and literature, and this was an especially valuable insight. That is, how history was not automatically given by the past, and how the past events have to be rendered historical. They're not automatically historical. They have to be rendered historical through a figurative initial, which could then be conceptualized as a kind of story. So Hayden White's insight about how you turn the past into history, I think, is extremely useful and important at this time. And especially White especially emphasizes how both literature and history could possibly be treated as two different kinds of artistic writing. That is, that differed from ordinary speech and writing by virtue of the use of a number of tropes and devices like metaphors and metonymy and so on. So remember, this is also the time when you're reading like Natalie Simon Davis's wonderful book, The Return of Martin Ware and so on. That book appeared in 1983 in English, and I think I read it in 1988. Zebon Davis, for example, I mean, it's difficult. In that is a book that actually looks like a novel. You know, it is a work of history, but you would enjoy it like you read a novel. So, to me, the idea that the events of the past are not automatically historical and that they must be worked up as possible objects, and that one could here choose a historical register or a literary register, or a novelistic register, was particularly important. And later on, especially, when I began to seek a history of anti-patriarchal discourse in Malayalam. So this is the second body, the second kind of theoretical debate in the 1980s that shaped my own journey as a historian who engaged actively with literary sources. And the third stream is that of new historicism and discourse analysis later. So new historicism, which pointed to the culturally specific matrix of texts as products of particular periods and discursive formations, while simultaneously pointing to how history was itself mediated by linguistic codes. That was quite revelatory to many of us. So, you know, the new historicism has a very, very interesting kind of methodology, especially in the early stages, the early phase of new historicism. So they first breach the text context barrier, and then they place the literary work within its broader and narrower historical context, and recovering the text's historicity. And then they connect these with the present of the reader. So that was the methodology, very brief. And new historicism, of course, became very, very widely discussed in university circles in my time, that is the 1990s. And it was quite powerfully convincing also to many of us. And for me, the passivity that one attributed to texts actually imposed on the text by one's own reading of it from the present was quite effectively dissolved, I think, by new historicism. And the irreducible historicity of every text became quite visible to me. So these were the broad theoretical currents of the 1980s, which shaped my own work as a historian. Now, but then the immediate context in which I turned to history as a source of literature, as a source of literature as a source of historical research, came from my own personal interest.
Devika, your mic.
Yeah, this mic is going off and off. Yeah, I didn't notice it. Yes,
fine.
Yes, so my interest in history arose from a very personal interest in understanding what one could describe as a gender paradox, which we were all living through. You know, in some ways, we were all highly educated, yet we were highly constrained in patriarchal ways and openly discriminated against. This seemed to be kind of a paradox for me, and I sought a historical answer to that question. Now, so therefore, besides the three theoretical debates, discussions that I mentioned, the prevailing wisdom on the history of women and gender in the 20th century. Am I audible now?
Yes, Devika, please go ahead.
Okay. So the 20th century was an important reason why I had to turn to print materials as a source. So in a sense, I was kind of setting aside my training from JNU, which focused largely on the archival materials. I realized that if I just use the archival material, then I probably will not be able to challenge the reigning wisdoms in 20th century, in the history, the prevailing understanding of 20th century Kerala. Now, for example, the category women was not absent in the dominant progressivist narrative. It was very much there. In fact, it was very much central. because the liberation of the Malayali woman was a very important strand in the narrative of liberation that framed our understanding of Kerala's 20th century in both academic and non-academic discourses. The story of how woman, and here this woman usually referred to the Nambudiri woman, was rescued by social reformer. The male social reformer was entrenched, and I don't know, maybe young people of this generation don't realize how central this figure was, how central V.T. Bhattacharya was, and how central the hapless Antarjanam was. Only those who lived through the 1980s would probably remember how central it was. It is no longer that way, I realize. Now, and when some women were identified with agency, they were usually conferred that by male literary authors. And more often than not, this was the case. A good example, of course, is that of Kuriyada Thatri. So her retellings of her story, like mostly by men, Madamunu, M. Govindan, later, of course, Krishnan, Guru. It's these people who are looking to grant her. Of course, the exception there is Lalitambika Annadan, but it's very interesting how even her retelling of that story, does basically make some critical adjustments within the larger terms set by these authors, by a certain male authorship. So it's interesting how it's interesting how one really saw that the audio is not clear.
No, it's fine. It's breaking a bit. Now it's fine. Yeah. Please continue.
All right. So I used to think that this was a bygone bad habit, because we knew that, for example, the Travancore's official history, a lot of it was borrowed from C.V. Raman Pillai's historical novels. So that was passed off as history. We knew that. So for me, I always thought it was some bygone bad habit of feudal authorities put it on historical investigation. They were happy with stories. I realized that this was not the case. It was actually, in fact, it was literary authors in Kerala who seemed to be eager, and these were men, of course. They seemed to be eager to retrieve from the past and, like Hayden White says, work on a certain bit of the past. And, accord to such women a certain agency, which to me looked very problematic. So, in fact, to me, that only added to this fairy tale of rescue, the male rescuer being absolutely necessary, even for somebody like Kuriyada Thatri. So, in order to question this fairy tale of rescue of women, I think, and I also considered quantitative methodologies, but again, I really saw that the quantitative methodologies were not enough, sufficient, were necessary perhaps, but not sufficient to reconstruct women's history, say, for example, in health or education, through the available records. Of course, one could always consult the census, or archival sources also could yield some data. But none of this that would essentially challenge the paradigm of progress and liberation-centered history writing, in which very clearly the terms were set by a certain patriarchal understanding of liberation. And obviously, numbers could hardly deal with human thought. That was the other thing. So, this was one side. And on the other side, I also saw that this whole idea, because whichever senior historian I spoke to, inevitably discouraged me, saying that there is no material. So what they meant probably was that there is no material in the archive. This I knew, of course. But the argument that there is no material was probably wrong. And it's probably a result of ignorance, because when I looked at the print sources, there was a lot. It was not as if women did not write at all. They did write. But then I also realized that it was not enough to set up these voices as an alternative to those of male reformers. Not to just say that, oh, K. Padmavati Amma is superior to B.T. Bhattacharya. Did not look like a solution to me, though it was necessary in some ways, definitely not a solution. Because I thought that, I realized that this could be absorbed very readily into the progressivist narratives, It would be like saying that women also ran, it's like conceiving of the past as a race towards modernity and progress. And we would be saying is, okay, some women also ran and some women could run faster than the men. That didn't look like, fundamentally different narrative. And of course, not to speak of the prevailing mood of the early 1990s, prevailing intellectual mood in the university circles of the 1990s in Kerala. At least where I worked, we had an extremely masculinist, post-structuralist orientation that bordered on bhakti, that much. And that kind of orientation would have simply ignored this, this effort. It would have just dismissed it as, in postmodernist terms, saying that, oh, all this is just another kind of modernism. So all you're saying that women were as modernist as men. So what is the big deal? So this would be very dismissive, and strategically that would not work for me. It was not enough. So in order to escape such dismissal and absorption, I decided to study not women, but the gendering of the individual, which meant that the material that would be available would suddenly grow. And this led me to draw upon a very large set of sources in print, wherever the individual, the whole question of what the individual is, the Vyakti individual, was being discussed. And soon it became apparent to me that binary gender was indeed the foundation of the most important languages of modernity in Kerala. At the same time, I had to struggle not to fall prey to the patriarchal reading of post-structuralism and gender, by which men and women were supposed to be equally subject to gender, and therefore past struggles did not really matter. Women, in other words, were not to be reduced to voiceless prisoners of gender. So in my own research, I struggled to achieve a kind of a balance in which I looked at the discourse of gender very closely at the one hand, and on the other hand, tried to identify the dissonance that women, the first generation of educated women particularly, were able to make in this discourse. So I had one whole chapter on women, the first generation feminists, in trying to redo discourse of gender. And I had a single chapter, a whole chapter, devoted to rereading the literary writing of Laladambika Andarina. I read it as precisely an individual's dissonance, the kind of an individual trying to take over the discourse of gender and recraft it in a way that would be, that according to her, would be more respectful of women. So this was the chapter. So obviously, so literature became, and then as I read, I kind of, this was also the time when discourse analysis became very fashionable in again, university circles in Kerala. And this gave me, and discourse analysis was particularly useful because you could now actually breach the text-context divide, fully. And you could now take literature as a specific form of communication with sets of norms associated with it. And in fact, you could look at literature as a network of genres, which included genres dealing with literature. So discussion on literature could also be now considered. And when you read a text, you could look at the enunciator, you could look at the author, as well as this figure who you never noticed earlier, writer. The writer as a social being, the writer as somebody who was placed within a literary public, following its rules or challenging its rules. So, and of course, it was evident to me by then that the field of literature was one that women had special access to. Not only did were women accepted as properly gendered for literature, so women were supposed to be full of literary potential. In some ways, women were supposed to be good with words and emotions and so on, and therefore they were supposed to be particularly suited for literary pursuit. And the public sphere made it possible because now you could write with a pseudonym if you wished. So many women actually started writing using pseudonyms. So this was a possibility open to them by the modern public sphere. So therefore, literature became especially important for me now. And literature was at once a site of the enunciation of modern binary gender, and the literary public sphere was structured by it. So both made very important. And as Stephen Greenblatt points out, the new historicist, the proponent of new historicism, Greenblatt points out, each enunciation is different. You can never repeat yourself fully. Every reiteration produces a tiny difference. And so exact duplication is almost impossible. And modern literature then became a practice of the self for many first-generation educated women. And many were seizing the opportunity, say, for self-fashioning in and through it. So here one could clearly discern how prominent literary women of the 20th century were crafting their own selves and, by using the terms set by the broader discourse of gender, but at the same time, changing it in a fundamental way. So once I was through with my first work, another work I already had decided then and there that I would actually attempt a brief, a history of the literary public. Now I was in a situation where the way I placed myself in the academic world did not permit me a lot of time to do that. So I did write a small book. It's called Woman Writing is Equal to Man Reading? ? I admit it's a strange title. But in this work, I tried to trace the history of anti-patriarchal literary writing by women in Malayalam in the 20th century, trying to make sense of the literary public as made up of many discursive communities. So this work conceived of Malayalam literature as a discursive field in which various positions come to. That every field is a space where different positions come to. So in Malayalam, the Malayalam literary field, there were and are many structured, complete, discursive communities that discuss universals, like gender, for example. But these are very local. These are all based in Kerala. They're very local. They're small groups, usually privileged groups of people. And they're also highly male-centered. And therefore, I call them, these circles, I call them homo-aesthetic circles. Homo-aesthetic circles, drawing upon the work of another literary theorist who talk about the homo. Her meaning is slightly different from mine. I adapted that term for Kerala's context. So here it became possible to trace the genealogy of feminist thought in Kerala through the literature. So this is the interesting thing. I realized that women used literature actually as a discourse to debate, frameworks of gender. So Saraswati Amma has a certain framework of gender which she is advancing through her literary writings. Andarjanam has another. So do Sarah Joseph or Madhavi Kuti or Rajalakshmi. So this kind of replays. So in other words, each of these women were engaging with the prominent homo-aesthetic circles of their time. In fact, some of these engagements were extremely traumatic to these women. And in Andarjanam's case and Saraswati Amma's case, as well as Madhavi Kuti or Sarah Joseph, in fact, traumatic enough for them to actually die, like Rajlakshmi. So these engagements were often really traumatic, but these engagements were real. And out of these engagements came new aesthetic proposals. So I found that Saraswati Amma and Madhavikutti and Andarjanam were not just saying things about women. They were actually challenging the dominant homoaesthetic circles and recrafting the dominant aesthetic strategies into feminist terms, translating those into feminist terms. Now, this, my account, was also aimed at replacing a teleological account, which was dominant at that time, which used a present understanding of feminism as a standard to weigh and judge women's anti-patriarchal writings from earlier times. And here I'm referring to Sachidanandan's much discussed preface to Sarah Joseph's collection Pavatara, where he devises a kind of a teleological understanding where feminist writings are graded on most progressive, more progressive, least progressive, most progressive, and so on. And so there's a teleological development from Andarjanam to Saraswati Amma to Madhavikutti to Sarah Joseph. And Sarah Joseph's work kind of is taken as exemplifying, feminist writing. Now, finally, I want to come to Swatantriya Vadini, which is what I am doing now. And again, here I've actually come full circle. I told you that in the late 90s, I had, for me, it was in the late 90s, in the late 80s, the retrieval project in feminism was not thought to be an effective strategy. I did not think it was an effective strategy to, in the atmosphere, the prevailing intellectual atmosphere, which is very, very male-dominated, very patriarchal at that time. I told you that in some ways, this project of retrieving heroines might have got absorbed fully into the, not absorbed into the, either got absorbed into the progressivist, which was also quite dominant at that time, progressivist narratives of 20th century Kerala, or it would have got completely dismissed and rejected by the reigning postmodernist gurus at that time. But now we have a different situation. 30 years down the line, we have a time in which feminists are being demonized. Feminists, everybody loves to kick a feminist, left and right. Everyone loves to kick a feminist. And in a way, now I'm practicing, in Swatantriya Vadini is a website. It's called swatantriyavadini.in. It's a website that I'm maintaining, where I am uploading. It's a memorial. It's a living memorial to first generation feminists. And here I have a whole bunch of writing by them. And I explicitly abandoned the literary, non-literary divide. So on Swatantriya Vadini, there are a lot of translations of literary writing by first generation feminists, as well as non-literary writings by them. And here I'm, in a way, practicing what Stephen Greenblatt mentions as the function of new historicism. And I quote him, he says that the function of new historicism is to renew the marvelous at the heart of the resonant. By which he means that, he also talks about how the anecdote is an effective way of introducing newness and arousing wonder. So when you present a fact, something from the past, which might not all, but if you take it out and you actually show the reader how this event from the past and your experience of the present are connected, then it arouses a sense of wonder. And he says that the power of wonder is such that it destabilizes the fixed logic of conventional historiography and allows a defamiliarization of it. To construct any kind of new history, any kind of history from the standpoint of the oppressed, you need to defamiliarize the past. If defamiliarizing the past is a central concern of any attempt to create a history from a new standpoint. So, and gender history is obviously, in order to defamiliarize, you need to present the past in a new light. You need to make it up as the past. And so, Swatantrya has excerpts, it has full literary text. It has excerpts from non-literary writing, which actually gives it a very fictional kind of feel, though one is extracting from legislative assembly debates and other kinds of things, and also other kinds of genres like autobiography, memoir, and so on. The feel is still literary. So I am using this website to defamiliarize the past, so that the demonization of the feminists in contemporary Kerala can be encountered with a fresh wonderment, fresh infusion of wonder to the history of women in Kerala. Now, intersection. If you ask me, however, now, Now I think, we do not think in terms of binary gender. If you ask me how we could do the history of gender using literary sources now, my first response would be to point out that we no longer think of gender as a binary. We don't think of gender as male-female anymore. We think of gender as far more fluid now. So you would have in the past, and if you ask me how I would look at the past from such a conception of gender, I think my reading of the past would be very, very, very different. For example, now if Andarjanam's novel Agnisakshi is, I read it as a classic example of how women, the first generation feminists, used the form of the novel to tell a history. Now, she openly says that, Andarjanam openly admits in her preface, the preface to Agnisakshi, that this is a history, that the Agnisakshi may be a story, but it's actually history. So she is telling a history of the women of her times through this novel. That's how I read it. But now, given that we are looking at gender in a very different way, we are no longer the heterosexual form of family is no longer the norm. How would I read it? Probably would have a queer reading of Agnisakshi. Because in Agnisakshi, of course, we know that the two central characters, Tankam and Devaki, when the moment of their parting is marked by a promise to each other that their children will be each other's children. That is, Tankam, Devaki says that your children will also be my children. That's how they part. So this is, I would read this as some kind of a longing, a yearning for an alternate family form, where two women could settle together with their children. And this is probably, and I would extend it, I would probably use it to interpret the end of the novel. You see, at the end of the novel, the culmination of the novel is when Tankam brings her son to Devaki and submits him and literally gives him to her. So in some ways, Tankam and Devaki come together. At the end of the novel, they come together and they symbolically perform this alternate family. And however, the limits of, because Andarjanam functions within the limits of heterosexual gender, there can be nothing else. And therefore, the novel has to end in a metaphor. So the novel ends in this metaphor of a sea of milk, an ocean of milk rising. So, so that's how I would read that. Saraswati Amma, for example, I would have read many of her texts as queer texts. A clear longing for a world of women, of a private, a homosocial private of women, and a gender-neutral public. Or say, a novel like Indulekha, for example. I would have read Sree as a queer character. Now remember the conversation between Sree Namboodiripad and Indulekha. And Sree Namboodiripad asks her if she's interested in Kathakali, and she gives him quite a sharp retort. And then he asks her, do you know, he describes this young man who plays a female character and asks her, do you know what he looks like when he has the makeup on? To which Indulekha says no. And then Sree says, he looks like you. Now that is a clear suggestion. That's a suggestion of clearness. For all these aspects, I would have taken into account, and I would have interpreted the text in those terms. Also, I would read, say, now given that this is our, now we know very well that now that our understanding of caste has become, and the intersection of caste and gender has become much sharper than it was in earlier times. I would have probably pushed back my timeline to the 17th century. And I would have understood the caste system itself, the whole Janma Bhedam order itself, in very different terms. In order to make, in fact, I would have tried to understand that past in terms of an intersection of the histories of resistance to caste power, non-binary gender, and the body. For example, how would you interpret? And this would have to rest solidly on literary evidence. On literary evidence coming from, say, the work of Unai and Ujjatambiyar, and myths like that of Nangeli, legends like that of Nangeli. You know, the legend of Nangeli, for example, and other stories would be the resource for this. And so you would think about pre-colonial Malayali society. You know, if you think about it, it is the Sankalpa Swargam, you know, according to the suggestions of Kerala and so on. The Brahmanical Kerala is the Sankalpa Swargam of the Brahmins. So, Brahmins are Bhudevas, Shudras are the Yaksha, Gandharva, Kinnara, the servant class in Swarga, and the others. So, what is the labor power that kind of powers this heaven? Well, that is objective. In heaven, you don't need this. You have, you know, the Kamadhenu, and you have all these other things. You know, Kamadhenu, which produces food, etc. So labor is not necessary in heaven. But in Kerala, the Sankalpa Swargam, the Malayali society, which is the Sankalpa Swargam of the Brahmanas on the earth, labor power is necessary. And the reproduction of the Brahmanas is also necessary. In heaven, it's not necessary, since all the devas have had amrita, so that keeps them. There's no need to reproduce. But on earth, you need to reproduce. So Brahmin women and Dalit communities have to be abjected. They cannot be just deprived. They cannot be just oppressed. They have to be abjected, kept away completely. And they have to be rendered completely invisible. You should not see them. You should not hear them. They should be killed at will. They are merely objects of production. They are mechanical objects that produce. This is how it was in Brahmanical Janma Bhedam order. Now, this idea, what I'm telling you, emerges from the literary sources and the myths and legends that survived from that time. So, Nangeli's struggle looks like a struggle for the body. Leave alone gender. First, the right to live in a female body without paying tax. That is what Nangeli's struggle is all about. So now I'm telling you, so therefore there is literary evidence, and here it is definitely literary evidence that allows you to reimagine the past in these terms. And so, taking a cue from Hayden White, I'm going to stop with this question. Maybe we need new modes and genres of presentation in writing history. Now, in Kerala, the job of writing history in a big way has been borne by our novelists, writers who have actually retold the past in very significant ways that influence people. I'm leaving you with this question, whether instead of just engaging with literature, should we not try to think of ways in which history as a form of writing could harness the power of literature. How we can do it without compromising, standards of epistemological, the epistemological compulsions under which we all live. So I'll stop that. It's nearly an hour. And I will be happy to answer any questions. Is that okay, Shiva?
Yes, Devika, that's fine. Do you want to take a break or something?
Kamachi, that's fine.
Yes. Okay. Teresa? Teresa, are you there or have your call dropped? I think our moderator's call has dropped. I think
I can read from the chat. I can see a few questions on the chat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Amshu Matthew, two questions there. One is on the question of truth in historical explanation while employing literature for historical. Now you see, Anshu, both questions seem to be proceeding from a certain empiricist, positivist understanding of history. Now you look at his literature not as a source of anecdotes or dates, or of course you can use that. That can happen. For example, Thottiyudamakkan, if you look at Thottiyudamakkan, there's almost nothing we have. We have almost no history, even in the archives, on the history of the sanitation workers in Kerala. Okay? We know that sanitation workers in Kerala were actually almost procured from the neighboring Tamil country and brought here and settled in the slum areas, the present day slum areas of most of the cities in Travancore, particularly Trivandrum and Alappuzha. We have absolutely no evidence, however. There's nothing much in the archives that tells you anything about it. In fact, the only source you probably have now are autobiographies and a novel, which is Thottiyudamakkan. But Thottiyudamakkan cannot be taken straight away as you can never forget the fact that this is a reconstruction by Thagari, by an author who's a writer, who's somebody who is situated in a particular way within the literary public and who has, of course, certain sociological coordinates very clearly that do not determine what he writes, but definitely shapes it. So when you're looking at the sanitation workers as they appear in Thottiyudamakkan, you are not looking for the truth of sanitation workers there. You're looking at how a certain elite-born author interested in, social justice, etc., in the framework of within a certain discourse of social justice that began to circulate in Kerala since the 1930s. How did such an author construct these sanitation workers? And therefore, how do these aspects of the writer's horizon, how do they shape sanitation workers as they appear in this novel? That's what you're looking at. You're not looking merely at some information. You're not treating the novel as if it were some encyclopedia. You might find some relevant dates, etc. That's another matter, which you might have other data, maybe from newspapers. So you may want to compare the dates mentioned and so on. Those are all possible. But essentially, you're not turning literature to get that kind of information. So when you look at literature, you are much more interested in the discourse. As I told you, literature is no longer looked upon as some product of genius, which that the history does not affect and therefore is timeless. We look at literature as a network of genres which generate discourse, which are shaped by other discourses in time. That is how we use it. So therefore the subjective data question does not arise at all. I think it might help you to get out of this positivist orientation, because that that is very limiting. You can, if you are a positivist, then there are just so many sources that you can use. You'll never be able to use anything more than a few whatever records that are available, and you'll keep on saying the same thing over and over again. What is interesting in using literature is that you're able to look at way in which whichever object of your interest, whether it's women, whether it's sanitation workers, whether it's school children, or whatever, how they are constructed in Kunyuni Sajeev. There a problem in considering gender as a complete social construction of the world? Well, that is well, you see, there is something called new materialist biology now, new feminist materialism, which questions this idea that gender is a complete social construction. They point out that the new research in genetics and endocrinology and so on show that sex and the body is also the gender of the body. I mean, sexual characteristics of the body are related to some of these, some genetic. There are genetic patterns, there are genetic factors, there are genetic, there are endocrinal factors, etc., which do shape gender, not just society. However, just because the fact of the matter is that the performed gender, what is called the performed gender that you and I possess, is not exclusively from social conditioning, nor is it exclusively from the biological aspects, that is the genetic and the endocrinological aspects. In fact, they point out that these actually shape each other tremendously. So if you have, say you have a certain genetic configuration, that will be activated only under certain circumstances. It does not get activated always. If you have, under certain social circumstances, your endocrinological profile can change. So this is what determines gender, not just society or biology. So the opposition that we usually pose between biology and society, they claim, must be rethought. Is that okay, Kunyuni? I mean, I don't know if he's here. Kunyuni here? Kunyuni here?
He's here in the group. The call dropped. Yes, he's here in the group.
Okay. All right. So, ready? What else could you do? Andarjanam Saknisakshi is worth looking at as history. So many others. Harish, Misha, this new controversial novel of Harish's could also be such a reconstruction of the past. So there are, of course, some are effective, some are not. I did not think much of Subhash Chandran or T.B. Sajeevan. But I definitely, now Meera's Aracha, for example, is an excellent, very, very interesting reconstruction of history. Rajashree's new novel, Dakshayani, Kalyani in Dakshayani, that is another fantastic reconstruction of the past. There are many of that kind. Also, various place historians, if any, were writing in Malayalam in the 1980s. Well, I think the ones I respect the most from the 1980s and 90s are the Dalit historians who did a great job, who used all kinds of material, and in fact, much before these theoretical discussions were in their place, actually breached all these divisions between literary and non-literary sources. They also refused to dismiss myths and legends. And in fact, even now, I mean, it's so surprising that even now we continue to ask questions like, oh, but Nangeli's protest, there is no evidence in the past for Nangeli's protest. It's such a impoverished view of this. The point is not whether Nangeli's incident was a real incident or not. What it tells us about power is the important thing. And that is how, once we try to understand the Nangeli myth, unless we have evidence to show that the Nangeli myth was fabricated sometime down the line, and we still don't have any evidence for that. If we, in fact, as long as we don't have clear evidence that it's fabricated, then, and if you triangulate it with other sources, clearly there is very good reason for us to think that the myth makes sense, helps us to understand pre-modern power relations. The point is, what I'm saying now was practiced much earlier by the Dalit historian, Sankaracharya, and many others. Dalit Bandhu N.K. Joseph's work, many others. But they are never really acknowledged as historians. They're all considered to be amateur historians. Could you mention any literary works mentioning the experience? Well, you know, nursing became an important profession for Malayali women only after the 1930s. So you better look for work after that. And you must look at popular writing, you know, because, yeah, you should look at so-called humor. If you're looking at popular writing, this is to Preeti George. If you're looking at popular writing, you should look at the terrible humor magazines. There were a lot of humor magazines in the 1940s, which are horrible, actually. Horrible in the sense that they're so full of extremely hurtful humor, directed at, helpless people. And the nurse was one of the most helpless people. So the caricature of the nurse with all kinds of insinuations, you know, that the nurse is a sexually compromised person or a prostitute, or whatever, all these kinds of things. You will find in the 1940s humor, so-called humor literature. And we need another term, actually. It's not humor, it's something else. And after that, maybe you should look at what is derided as Pingley's idea. You know, the popular novels that were published in magazines. You must look at journals like Malayalam Manorama or Mangalam or Manita and so on. You won't get anything for early 20th century, but that's natural because Malayali nurses were few in the early 20th century. Malayali nurses became more and more frequent in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. I'm quite sure that in the 70s you might find some novels. Movies, of course, you know there are a lot. At those movies.
Thank you, ma'am.
Textual analysis, the predominant method of engaging with literature. And you talk I know, Ardra, I was your examiner. At least for your MPhil, I was your examiner. So I do know that you have worked with the politics of literature question. Yes, I know that. Now, textual, well, I would say discourse analysis. Textual analysis, well, as I told you, textual analysis is very useful because it allows you to treat the text not as some sacred object, but as something that could be shaped in history. So you could identify the literary devices and other things, the tropes and devices and other literary devices which are employed by writers in texts. So you could do a historical analysis on those grounds. So textual analysis could actually help you to do that. But the kind of work that helped me in the 1980s, the theoretical frames, the method that helped me in the 1980s was discourse analysis. Once you treat literature as discourse, you know, as participating in discourse, it's not the same as discourse, but it is part of discourse. It's a kind of discourse. It's a kind of form. It's a form that can participate in different discourses. So once you take that into account, the textual analysis allows you to make sense of the form. And discourse analysis is what allows you to place the content, understand the content, and for this, discourse analysis reaches the text-context division. So that helps you to understand literature as a form of discourse. So in methodological challenges faced by us in interdisciplinary studies using, so I think this should work. This should be enough, because in interdisciplinary, when you mean interdisciplinary, you mean say a work of sociology that wants to use literature. In that case, yes, because literature being a form of discourse, because maybe you're doing a dissertation on the family, a sociological dissertation of the Malayali family, and you would definitely want to look at the representation of the ideal Malayali family in society, and a very good place to find that is definitely popular literature, popular forms of literary writing, because you will have to take into account the possibilities and constraints of that form, but definitely you will be able to find these. Of course, therefore the representations will be shaped by that form, right? But if you take into account both, then you can provide your readers with a rigorous account on how the representation of family is reproduced, reiterated, circulated, modified, etc. through literature, and how the very form of literature that shapes this presentation. And you can also see how that seeps into policy. You can also look at the intertextual sharings in, say, for example, policy discourses on the family. So,
thank you so much, ma'am.
Do we have time for more? Because there is another question. Anjali PR has a question.
Yes, we have enough time. Your mic, Devika? Yes.
Srinivas Rao has a question, but again, I have already addressed that in my earlier response to Amshu. And I think we are far beyond Collingwood now. We are not talking about imagination or truth. We are not trying to say that the book will lead us to the truth. The literary text will lead us to the truth. That is out. So I think that answers Srinivas Rao's question. And Anjali, how do you deal with the question of authorship? And that's what I was trying to say, that besides the enunciator and the author, you have what is called the writer, and the person who writes this book, the person who is situated in specific discourses, who has a certain sociological, set of sociological coordinates, who functions within a certain number of a certain network of institutions that may be literary and non-literary. This definitely shapes the writer. So I'm saying that you need to pay attention to the writer. As for authorship, once you're talking about, because you see the problem is discourse, a certain interpretation of discourse analysis says that you don't need the author anymore, that the author is not important anymore. What is important is the discourse. Yes, at one level, yes. But for those of us who are interested in, I think, more than just the discourse, those of us who are interested in the politics of discourse, we cannot really afford to ignore the writer. And that's what I think. Is there a way in which we can read gender and affect in literature without the nativized completely on the one hand? Meta narrative of this. Is Sandhya here?
Yes, I'm here.
Sandhya.
Yeah, so my question is about, and especially when it comes to post-structuralist kind of take on literature, and the problem that you mentioned earlier of relativizing gender to the extent where it, you drawing all kinds of false equivalences, and reducing all kinds of, let's say, histories to this flattened out landscape. So without relativizing it completely on the other, but also without creating a meta-narrative of gender or any other large conceptual structure on the other hand. Is there a way that we can avoid both of these pitfalls when looking at any kind of writing, not just gendered writing, in literature?
Well, I think that's a very, very empirical challenge, I mean, I think you can actually do it. And I think this is what I wanted to, this is roughly, not exactly, but this is exactly almost what I wanted to point out when I told you that the particular the circumstance, intellectual climate of the early 1990s was such that I needed to create this careful balance, I'm just asking you if I'm right, because for me, the challenge was that on the one hand, if I focused on just the voices, treated them as absolute, then it would be very easy for the progressivists to just absorb this and silence it.
That's right.
And on the other hand, you had the post-structuralists there, who would dismiss all this as just another expression of modernity, nothing more than that.
Yeah.
What's new?
Yeah.
So that was my challenge. So somewhat similar to what you are mentioning here, because either you had to kind of relativize and say, okay, I'm just going to do this, or you fall into this trap of, what the postmodernists want you to do, which is to look at gender, then you flatten out politics, you kind of totally remove it, and you say that, okay, men and women are equally affected by discourse, are equally shaped by discourse. So then men also suffer the violence of discourse. So why should we? That sort of, so there was this either or veering between the two. You had to be very careful, you could do neither. So you had to, on the one hand, accept this, accept the post-structuralist invitation to look at gender rather than women.
Right.
But at the same time, make sure that you did fall into the trap that was ready, that prepared and there already. So that's why literature became so important for me as a historian. Because in literature, you had, this was a space where, of course, the shaped by the discourse of binary gender. The literary institution itself was gendered, but it was a place where women as writers refused to be reduced to authors, and they kind of reshaped it as a place where they could try for, became a technique of the self for these women. And so then they were reiterating gender in a way that would just be not a duplication. So literature allowed me to negotiate that. So I think in narratives also, I think you have to probably look at, depends on the kind of narrative that you might want. Within whatever narratives you're examining, you probably have to look at some particular genre of narrative where you can actually see, some kind of an effort to balance or avoid both extremes. Perhaps what you might have to do.
Thank you.
Aparna, I think I've answered Aparna's question. I never said literature reflects society. I said literature constructs society, not reflect. And the politics of that construction is what is of interest. Nina Abraham. Thanks, Devika. Are there letters of the early women writers? Yes, well, there are no letters, but there are petitions, there are autobiography, excerpts from autobiography, memoir. I don't have any letters, but if you can share, then I'll be very happy to include them. Do you find the difference in their literary and non-literary work and in their letters? No, I told you I don't have much letters. I don't. Well, I said I don't have many letters, but literature and non-literary work, of course, there are differences because the literary genre permits something and the non-literary genre permits something else. Yet, it's interesting how an important common feature that binds some of the best literary authors, Malayalam authors, female literary authors in Malayalam, is that they inevitably use the literary register to write about non-literary events. That's interesting. Now, for example, there is Andarjanam in, if I remember, it was 1926. Wrote this short story called Pedagadi Kondulla Pedagadi. That was about the Nayar Bill. The Nayar Bill. Of course, we know she has written about Pratigara Devada was written about the Kuriyedu Dadris, Martha Vichara. So that way, and then when you come to, when you come to others like Sarah Joseph, we know she has written about contemporary things, or K.R. Meera and others. So this is something very common, using the literary register. No, no, Sajid. I haven't. I've heard of her, but I haven't followed her. Yes. Why, Sajid? Are you here?
Yes, I am very much here.
Okay. So why did you think of Polgar now? Because I've heard of her.
No, because the first thing is that when you look at the question and when you are reading it and then you are thinking of the answer, there's quite a large similarity with Judith Polgar behind the chessboard. And that is a big puzzle which has to be solved in the sense that from a feminist perspective, the path that Judith Polgar has taken, she has defeated almost all the great champions.
I know. I mean, that's why I was like,
yeah. And the way she took it, that at one point of time she stopped playing also. Basically because there was nobody in the women's side who could compete with her.
Yeah.
And the chess didn't allow women to play against men for the world. So that's an interesting model which has to be studied, it seems, on the way she has taken the games and the way she has played also. The nearest person who come closer is the current champion, Carlson, who has taken the whole game with a long history and with large games, but coming up with a totally different perspective of the game and taking it from a totally different perspective. That makes a big difference.
Oh, that's a great compliment. Thank you. Okay, Marietta Nasaret. Could you explain how questions regarding gender in gender universities? Oh, this is fabulous. You could, Marietta, there's no one answer to your question, but I'm quite sure you should. There is plenty you could do, because obviously, you see, the thing about the literature is for women particularly. It was indeed important because it was a place where they could write about intimacy. In fact, the politics of intimate spaces was something. In fact, what is reportedly the first short story in Malayalam by a woman. And now that theme has been rewritten again and again. It's about, have you read, you must have probably read Lalithami's short story called Ida Ashasya Mama, about a woman who is constantly being derided, insulted by her husband for being uneducated, useless, confined to the kitchen and so on. In the end, the husband discovers that she is much better than him and that she actually won a prize. And she gave up the prize because she knew that her husband would be deeply hurt because he had competed in that. He had competed for that prize. So she gives up the prize. She writes in a pseudonym and she wins the prize, but she doesn't want it because her husband is deeply hurt. Now the same theme you find, rewritten by this first short story appeared in 1915. 1930s, you have Lalithami Andaran writing Ida Ashasya Mano as a response to certain, extremely misogynistic discussions that happened in the Nambudiri reform movement. Now, here, the story is about the politics of intimacy, how women and men, the husband and wife sharing the same space, intimate space, and how being in that intimate space shapes their responses. So I think you should look closer at these questions. Of course, the novel would give you a different dimension. The novel might look at the history of intimacies, might give you some kind of an insight into that. And the short story is, of course, always a tool in the 20th century at least. It was a tool by which you commented on contemporary issues. Yeah. So I think we are done, right? Are there no questions? I think we are done. Unless somebody wants to ask.
I think that's it. You can wait. Yeah? One sec. Teresa, are you here?
Yes, ma'am, I'm there. Thank you, Devika, ma'am, and participants for making this session very interactive academic one. I invite Abdul Basit, MPhil student, Sri Shankara University, to deliver vote of thanks.
Good evening to all. It is an immense pleasure for me to express my gratitude to everyone present in this session. We are grateful to Dr. J. Devika for expressing her views on the topic Literature and the Creation of a Gender Archive. Dr. Devika has shared with us different shifts which she took in her journey towards writing gender histories. She also talked about how history can be also traced through literature, and how women's literary writings can be read in a way as to understand the histories of women of the time. She has also talked about how the same writings can be reread from a queer perspective. She has also made sure that despite the numerous questions asked, she has answered all the questions in the chat section. On behalf of the Department of History, Sri Sankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, I express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Devika for her insightful talks and for making the webinar effective and informative. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
I would also like
for
to
this
thank
opportunity.
Kerala Council of Historical Research and Sri Sankaracharya University of Sanskrit for extending support to conduct the webinar. I would also like to express my deep sense of appreciation to the technical support provided by the organizing team. Last but not the least, I would like to thank each one of you for your active participation all throughout this webinar series. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Devika.
Then, yeah, thanks a lot again. Yeah. So see you.
Bye.